They might be cheap, they might have surprisingly interesting integrated graphics, especially these days, and they're everywhere and in all kinds of shapes and sizes. So could these ancient machines, well, at least based on their architecture, still be good for anything? Or, quite frankly, would a modern alternative be a better solution, given the scarcity of things right now? I don't know. For funsies, let's just take a look at a lot of these old AMDs and let's see what they are capable of. Alright, before we start the video, obviously I gotta introduce the machines themselves, but I also just want to preface that this video is mainly made for fun. It's not for any real educational purpose, just for the sake of curiosity, but it could also have some pretty interesting takeaways as far as a buying guide, I guess, if you will. But I wouldn't go too strongly taking this information as fact. So first up is the oldest machine of them all, and this one actually uses pre-construction equipment, I guess is what it's called, CPU architecture with Terascale 2 based graphics. This is the A6 3420M with a true quad-core CPU, albeit not really a good one. It's based on the K10 CPU architecture on 32 nanometers, but it does actually have 4 physical cores, which is pretty nice. And they do clock all right, but they're not amazing, especially considering the time period. This would have been from about late 2011 to early 2012, mostly 2012, and the graphics are actually not too terrible. You'll see that soon when we get into the benchmark figures. Next up, we have the HP NV15, which actually uses pile driver based CPU architecture. I believe that is the first generation of the construction equipment era from AMD. The graphics are actually pretty surprising based on the numbers comparative to the other generation, but there are some architectural improvements. The CPU does boost a little bit higher than the other one, and it does have faster memory. So all in all, this machine, despite not having level 3 cache, which really wasn't even common back then, this machine should put up a pretty interesting fight, especially considering it has up to 768 megs of shared video memory. Of course, just based on the specs on screen. This particular machine I don't hold high hopes for. This one is the A4 5000, which is a quad-core, in air quotes, processor, but you really wouldn't know it because there's no boost clocks, and it uses, technically I speak, 2 modules, 4 threads. It's based on the same CPU architecture, codenamed Jaguar, used with the Xbox One and PlayStation 4. But the graphics are significantly more cut down, and they don't have very many clock cycles to use, so this one's not going to look really good on the numbers. This one actually is going to be interesting. This one uses a Kaveri-based APU, the A10-7300 with this stupid naming scheme up above. This one actually has surprisingly decent Radeon R6 dubbed graphics with up to 1 gig of shared video memory, and the CPU is, well, despite using a 2-module, 4-thread design, so technically speaking it is 2 cores and 4 threads, not 4 cores like AMD brands it, this one might actually not do too terribly amongst all the other APUs, but the numbers will just have to prove and see. And yeah, don't mind the touchscreen, it's cracked, I know that. The last few machines are also going to be from a limited power envelope. This one is the A6 7310. Yeah, it's not the 7300 A10, that's AMD's stupid naming scheme. Either way, this one, I don't believe it's going to fare too well because, unfortunately, this one has single channel memory. Thanks, Lenovo, for limiting the design of this thing. But I guess it could be a interesting contender. It uses Puma Plus architecture, which, I don't know, it's low power intentionally designed, but we'll just have to see how it holds up in the benchmarks. The last machine here, I really am kind of surprised that it still works. This one is unfortunately power throttled, this A10-8700P. This one uses excavator architecture, so again, it's back to 2 modules and 4 threads, but it's in a thin and light package. Now this one has the fastest memory support of all of them because this one came out in about 2015 or so, and I believe this one led into the Bristol Ridge generation where they actually had DDR4 support. But the graphics, well, as long as this thing wasn't power throttled, could actually be quite an interesting machine, but unfortunately, like I said, yeah, this thing's got some damage, the battery doesn't work, and, well, I can't get the full performance out of this thing, so I just left it in here for the sake of filler because, well, I mean, it might actually perform decent if you had a fully working machine. The last machine I'm using for the sake of modern comparison is not really the most ideal, but it is interesting enough that I'll put it in here. This is the Surface Laptop 4 with the AMD Ryzen 5 Microsoft Surface Edition, known as the 4680U. Now this machine has an extra graphics compute unit compared to the standard 4600U Ryzen Pro, but it also has the full Ryzen Pro CPU, so 6 cores and 12 threads. Unfortunately, this has soldered memory, but it is LPDDR4X memory, so it is actually quite fast memory and can be useful for graphics applications like this. But it also has a much newer Vega graphics architecture, which isn't fantastic, but it's certainly a lot better than the old APUs. So I'll just be using this for the sake of comparison because it has, well, not the best driver support, but it's certainly a lot better than what these other machines have. So at least give a modern perspective on things. The only thing that I can see being a problem for these machines going forward is their CPU performance. Not necessarily about their other features, but mainly the CPU performance. These APUs, pre-Ryzen, were throughout AMD's low period in history. And I generalize it as the low period in history because these are variants of what I would probably dub the construction equipment series of CPUs from within 2012 to 2017. That includes code names like Piledriver and Excavator and Bulldozer, I believe is one of them I have here today. Don't quote me on that, but they also have different variations of names based on which platform they're using. Say, for example, you have one of these machines based on Jaguar. Well, that'd be the, I believe, A4 5000 is based on Jaguar, so it has very poor CPU performance. So already, we're not off to a fantastic start because we already know how those consoles are aging today. Not very good CPU performance. But also, some can be a pleasant surprise compared to some of their newer counterparts, like, for example, the A8 5550M back there. So I guess without further rambling, let's go ahead and get into the results, and let's see how all these machines did. Let the results begin. So, any footage you see on screen is going to be recorded from my main machine, but all the results, of course, will be recorded from these 6 laptops as they are defined. First game on the list is the easiest one that these machines ran, which was Golf with Your Friends. Now, normally with this game, I test with a map called Worms, but I decided for this one to use a high frame rate map known as the Escapists. Tested at 720p resolution with the in-game preset set to low. Turned off VSync and any forms of anti-aliasing and went about doing the benchmarks. Surprisingly, the best machines other than the Ryzen 5 Surface laptop were the A6 3420M and A8 5550M powered machines, which took me by surprise. Although, I guess to those machines' credit, they do have pretty decent performing memory, and for that matter, they have a little bit more architectural advantages. I don't know, maybe it's clock speed, I couldn't tell you for sure. Either way, it seemed like all the other machines seemed to lag behind. By no means not unplayable, but I certainly want to go playing on the A6 7310, or for that matter, the A4 5000, especially not the A4 5000. That thing had some pretty weak performance, at least as far as the CPU is concerned. It had the worst 0.1 and 1% lows out of all the machines tested today. But still, an impressive showing for all these machines nonetheless. Next up is BioShock. Now, the footage is from the remastered version. I apologize if it looks way better than it should, but whatever, it doesn't matter. So, at 720p with all these APUs using the original 2007 release, I used the medium preset because I was like, you know what, that could be an interesting compromise, and it turns out I wasn't actually too far off. Now, none of these unfortunately hit 60 FPS, again, except for the Ryzen 5, but surprisingly, the A10 7300 was able to slightly pull ahead of the 2 others that normally have done so well so far, at least from my testing, which is the A6 3420M and the A8 5550M. But still, at least every single APU in this list got at least 30 FPS. Now, I'm sure with some of the lower end ones, you could probably benefit from lowering the preset to low, and you could probably get away with that, no problem. But at least for all these machines, if you wanted to play BioShock, the original release from 2007 anyway, you shouldn't have a major issue with these, although, again, going back to the A6 7310 and A4 5000, you're not really going to have a great time. They have lackluster CPUs, as well as, in the case of the A6, single-channel memory, so they're not brilliant by any stretch. Next up is Grid from 2007, not the 2019 version, because I'm almost absolutely certain that would not run on these machines. This game is surprisingly well optimized. It uses a modified version of the Dirt engine, and, well, if you manage your settings properly, you can actually get a fairly playable experience on most of these machines, with the exception of the other 2 that have zeros. Well, we'll get to that here in a second. At 720p resolution, just like all the other games tested today, I chose the medium preset, which defaulted to 2x MSA8 anti-aliasing, so I was like, you know what the heck, let's see what it does to the performance figures. And yeah, it's kind of demanding, a lot more than I was expecting, which, I mean, impressively, the A6 3420M was the best one to pull out of the range here. Something about that first generation APU is really the most impressive part, but yeah, I guess it shouldn't be unspoken. The other two machines that did alright, the A10 7300 and the A8 5550M, were pretty good showers as well. Obviously, lowering the settings here would mean that you get a little bit more frame rate, but I think we've hit a hard CPU bottleneck with all of the pre-Ryzen APUs here. And for the A4 5000 and the A6 7310 that didn't have any results on here, well, unfortunately, I just decided to disqualify them from this particular game because of the fact that they were so stuttery. It was unplayable to the point where it just was really not enjoyable to try to record benchmark figures from these machines. So I just decided it's not worth it to try to put them on this list. Left 4 Dead 2 is an oldie but a goldie, but unfortunately for these AMD APUs, it was not the most pleasant experience. This really does depend on high frame rates to play, and at native resolution of most of these machines, with the exception of the Gateway, which had the A4 5000, medium settings, these did not do so great. Once again, we were hitting a hard CPU bottleneck, not necessarily with the graphics, but again, the CPU just kept choking because we kept trying to push as much frame rate out of it as we could. Probably could have tweaked some of these settings, but at the end of the day, if your game is not really able to run when you're having a hard CPU bottleneck even here, well, I don't hold much hope in the actual game performing well when you are trying to maximize frame rates when you're already running into a bottleneck. So I left it here. And again, back to the A4 5000 and the A6 7310. Those machines, unfortunately, they just were, again, so micro-stuttery and also like really bad to the point where it was unplayable, so they were also disqualified. You can kind of get an idea as to what I'm talking about by the A10 8700P, which, as I mentioned earlier in this video, is power throttled. Yeah, that 1% low figure does not look pleasant. At least all of these machines in comparison to the Ryzen 5 that's up above, well, they just get absolutely schooled here. It's not like this game is exactly hard to run, but you just need to have that high frame rate, which these just can't provide. So I just wanted to have a bit of fun and run the in-game benchmark of Tomb Raider 2013, and with the lowest possible settings at 720p resolution, which is of course not reflected in the video that's behind this, well, you got an interesting set of results. Impressively, the A6, the first gen one, lagged behind the A8 as well as the A10 7300. I wonder if that's just because of the fact that it's using 1333 MHz DDR3 in this case versus 1600 MHz DDR3, because it is limited in that respective right, but whatever. At least all these machines don't hold a candle to the Ryzen 5 based machine, which could easily play this game with a higher preset and higher resolution if you so choose to do so. But the one that really impressed me the most was the A6 7310 pulling ahead of the A4 5000. That really took me by surprise, despite only having single channel memory. That thing must, have that much more raw power. And of course, it's unfortunate the A10 8700P didn't pull ahead of all the other ones, but it's just power throttled, so unfortunately that is what it is. And lastly, this is the most demanding game from 2017. Using DirectX 9, I still think, is a hat in time, and I knew for a fact this game was not going to run well on the vast majority of all these machines, probably with the exception of the Ryzen 5, and I was correct. These APUs are so badly CPU bottlenecked that they can't even begin to try to play this game with playable frame rates. And even the Ryzen 5 had a bit of struggle with this. I wonder if it's just because the game is more optimized for GeForce graphics. It potentially might be because it was a port from the Nintendo Switch or something like that, where it was optimized for the NVIDIA hardware inside of that console. Either way, this game was unplayable on all of the pre-Ryzen APUs, which I was not surprised to see. And that's really all I have to say for this video. I mean, I could go down the route of emulation, and that would probably be fine. I mean, emulators would probably work from the PlayStation 1 and older. Perhaps you might even be able to push it with a Sega Saturn, although I've never really ventured into that territory. But I would probably say consoles from the mid 1990s and earlier, well, these machines will already be able to do no problem, so there's no real reason to venture into doing that. I mean, even with a more modern computer, you could probably do a little bit better, including Nintendo 64 emulation, which maybe you might be able to do on a machine like this. I could probably see that occurring because the N64 has kind of been cracked open at low-level emulation for a little while now, so I don't know. But you definitely would not be able to do things like PlayStation 2 emulation with a machine like any of these, because the CPU performance, and for that matter the graphics performance, it's just not going to work. You're going to get very subpar performance, and for that matter, even if you were to try to run things off the disk, it's just not going to run too great. Trust me. I already ventured into some stuff like that with these machines. I didn't show it on the video because it just wasn't worth showing, but I explain it here because it's worth pointing out. Don't buy these for the sake of emulating older consoles, or at least not ones past the mid-90s. So I guess if you took anything away from this video about trying to buy one of these machines, well, hopefully it helps you out. These aren't completely useless, one more time. They are not completely, unusable for modern day things. They can still be used for watching videos, doing office tasks, perhaps video conferencing, and the like. They're going to do that stuff just like any other machine, or for the most part, every other machine can do. And that's fine. I mean, these things are completely useless in the grand scheme of things. They're just not going to be useful for games and taking advantage of what used to be their graphics, unless, of course, you have a lot of older games and this is the only machine that you have access to, or if you already have one and whatnot, then sure. And maybe there might be some more topics to explore down the road with a machine such as, well, the HP with the A10-7300, or even the HP Envy. And both machines of which I am going to be keeping, by the way. On a side note, I am unfortunately going to have to pitch a couple of these machines. The Samsung, as I was doing this, unfortunately the keyboard started going out. And that's really unfortunate because it types random keys and it sucks. So I'm going to have to get rid of it. And furthermore, actually, I should note this too. Watch your vendors if you do happen to have one of these things, because driver support on these is a nightmare. Samsung removed all their drivers for their laptops running Windows 7, I think, for the most part. So it makes it really difficult to find software for these machines. If I were you, and I know this isn't going to be an end-all be-all case, but if I were you, I would avoid certain vendors. There's certain ones that I would actually stick to, like HP, Lenovo, and Toshiba. Those are usually vendors that have excellent driver repositories, and they still actually keep their drivers up. But you also got to watch out for HP as well, because they will remove older drivers. But generally, those are backed up by the community, and they're easily accessible. So it's not the end of the world. It just makes it more of a pain in the ass than anything. And then there's Gateway. This is an oddball one, because the original Gateway was bought out by Acer, and technically their old drivers page for their machines, like these well and truly Acer-made gateways from about 2014 and prior, are up. Now, they only go back so far. This machine is still on their website, so you can still get all the software for this machine, which is great, but I don't know how much longer that's going to be the case for. And the same thing goes for e-machines, because, of course, that's kind of the same thing, too. You kind of got to watch out for that as far as drivers go, because they were also bought out by Acer. So, needless to say, if you happen to have one of these things, not that I, again, would advocate going out and buying one, but just watch your vendors, because you might only be able to get drivers for the graphics, and you might not be able to find any of the other drivers. And if you're running an older operating system, well, good luck, because, Windows 10 will be your saving grace, but it's only going to do so much for you, so you got to watch out. Anyways, now that tangent has finished, I'm also going to be pitching that Toshiba because its battery's completely toast. The casing has damage. It really doesn't charge batteries even if the battery does work, and for that matter, the thing's got a grinding fan whenever you flex the chassis, and it's got a broken space bar, and the backlighting on this machine's keyboard is it's kind of all over the place. So needless to say, that machine's going to get tossed out after I part it out. Same thing with the Samsung. So yeah, reduce, reuse, recycle, I guess. But that just means that all the lemons get dunked. I don't know what I'm going to do about the Lenovo IdeaPad. Maybe that might be worth hanging on to. It is a small machine as far as its thinness, and it's not completely useless, but I just don't like its single channel memory performance. It's, at least maybe I'm missing a slot of memory under the motherboard or something, but as far as I'm concerned, it only has the one slot because of cost cutting. And for that matter, these APUs I think only had support for single channel memory anyway, so it's not the most effective thing. But I guess it could be useful for testing things with Linux, so it's not completely useless, because like all these APUs, they all have excellent Radeon graphics driver support under Linux, built right into the kernel. At least nowadays, they're going to be built right into the kernel. So it makes it super easy to get Linux running on one of these machines. And I might venture into that with things like this Gateway and that Lenovo, but it's hard to say really, because all in all, I mean, they're not going to be the fastest things out there. But Windows 11 has been kind of nice, especially for some of these machines, but not for others, especially with hard drives. So rambling aside, hopefully you learned something or took something away from this video if you are actually using it for educational purposes. And with that having been said, I'm going to get out of here and finally put this project to rest. If you like what you saw, ultimately speaking, then you know what to press. If you didn't like it so much, even though there's no counter beside it anymore, well, then you also know what to press. Get subscribed down below so you don't miss when I upload new videos, which is hopefully going to change, but no guarantees as usual. And click the bell so when I do upload videos, you will know when they arrive on your subscriptions feed. And with that having been said, I'm going to get out of here. So thank you all so much for watching, and I'll hopefully see you all in the not too distant future.